The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm over the Pacific Ocean. But Admiral Kiichi Nagumo's stomach churned with an unease he couldn't shake. Standing on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, he watched his pilots prepare for what should have been Japan's decisive blow against the American naval base at Midway Atoll. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was audacious in its scope: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap and annihilate it in one crushing engagement. Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 aircraft carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Haralong, with 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. His 108 Zero fighters and dive bombers had proven themselves invincible from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, yet something felt wrong about this morning's operations. The first wave of aircraft had already departed for Midway at 6:30 in the morning, but the reconnaissance planes that should have confirmed American fleet positions were running behind schedule. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 aircraft toward the atoll, their mission to soften the American defenses before the main assault. Nagumo had kept half his aircraft in reserve, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically for ship attack should the American fleet dare to show itself. What Nagumo didn't know was that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had deciphered enough of the Japanese naval code to understand that AF, the target mentioned repeatedly in intercepted messages, was Midway. They had even confirmed this through a clever ruse, having Midway radio in plain language that its water purification system was broken, only to intercept Japanese communications mentioning that AF was short of fresh water. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had positioned his forces accordingly. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and consisting of the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, lay in wait northeast of Midway. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the carrier Yorktown, had taken position nearby. The Americans had achieved what military strategists dream of. They knew exactly where their enemy would be, while remaining invisible themselves. As Tomonaga's aircraft approached Midway at 6:20 that morning, they encountered fierce resistance from Marine fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The base's defenses, though ultimately overwhelmed, inflicted significant damage on the attacking force. More critically, Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo at 7 o'clock, "There is need for a second attack wave." This single message would trigger a cascade of confusion that would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. He launched his reserve aircraft immediately against the suspected American fleet, or should he rearm them for a second strike against Midway's stubborn defenses? The admiral chose to hedge his bets, ordering his reserve planes to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for land targets instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed to sink ships. As Japanese deck crews frantically began switching ordnance, the morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere beyond the horizon, American dive bombers were already taking off from their carriers, guided by the most crucial intelligence coup of the war. The trap Yamamoto had set for the Americans was about to become a snare that would catch the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Instead, the morning of June 4th revealed the first critical flaw in Japanese planning when the reconnaissance aircraft failed to launch on schedule. Nagumo had ordered 7 search planes to fan out across the northern Pacific to locate the American fleet. But mechanical problems and poor coordination plagued the mission from its start. The float plane from the cruiser Tone, assigned to search the most likely sector where American ships might lurk, departed 30 minutes late due to a faulty catapult. This delay would prove catastrophic, for it meant that the Japanese would discover the American fleet only after their own forces had committed to the wrong course of action. The search plan itself reflected the overconfidence that had infected the Japanese command since their string of victories. Yamamoto's staff had assumed the Americans would react predictably, sailing from Pearl Harbor only after Midway came under attack, giving the Japanese ample time to prepare for their arrival. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was now aboard Akagi, recovering from appendicitis, watched the unfolding confusion with growing alarm. The veteran aviator understood better than most that naval aviation required split-second timing and unwavering commitment to a chosen course of action. Yet here was Nagumo, caught between two contradictory objectives, with insufficient information to choose wisely between them. At 7:45, the situation deteriorated further when American aircraft from Midway began their own attack on the Japanese fleet. Obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers and Flying Fortress heavy bombers approached from different directions, forcing Nagumo to launch his remaining fighters for air defense. The attacks themselves proved ineffective. Not a single Japanese ship suffered significant damage, but they consumed precious time and fuel while revealing the Americans' determination to fight. More troubling was the pattern of these attacks. American planes seemed to know exactly where to find the Japanese fleet, suggesting a level of intelligence gathering that made Nagumo's staff deeply uncomfortable. Had their communications been compromised? Possibility seemed unlikely given the complexity of their naval codes. Yet the evidence was mounting that the Americans possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had, according to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative account in the Toshin War. The Japanese failure to maintain proper reconnaissance would prove to be their undoing in the Pacific theater. At 8 o'clock, Nagumo received another message from Tomonaga's strike force, now engaged over Midway. Enemy fighters were putting up stronger resistance than expected, and several Japanese aircraft had been shot down. The base's air defenses remained largely intact, despite the bombardment, meaning a second strike would indeed be necessary to neutralize Midway's ability to launch further attacks against the Japanese fleet. The decision to rearm his reserve aircraft now seemed logical to Nagumo, but it would take nearly an hour to switch from anti-ship weapons to high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking land targets. During this crucial window, his flight decks would be cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines, making his carriers vulnerable to attack. Standard doctrine called for maintaining a reserve strike force at all times, but Nagumo convinced himself that no American ships could possibly be in the area yet. At 8:20, the delayed reconnaissance plane from Tone finally reported sighting American ships to the northeast, but the message was frustratingly vague. Have sighted 10 ships? Apparently enemy. The pilot provided no details about ship types or whether any carriers might be present. Nagumo immediately radioed back, demanding clarification. But precious minutes ticked away. While the message traveled across the Pacific and the pilot maneuvered for a better look at the American formation, the admiral now faced his worst nightmare. American ships were indeed present, but he had committed his reserve aircraft to the wrong mission. His flight decks were in chaos as ordnance crews worked frantically to switch bomb loads once again, this time back to anti-ship weapons. The carefully choreographed ballet of carrier operations had become a confused scramble with fuel lines snaking across decks littered with bombs and torpedoes, while Admiral Nagumo struggled with incomplete information and conflicting priorities. His American counterparts enjoyed an intelligence advantage so complete it bordered on the supernatural. The breakthrough had come months earlier when cryptographers at Pearl Harbor's station HYP, led by the brilliant and eccentric commander Joseph Rochefort, had penetrated the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated J-UN-25, by American intelligence. Rochefort's team worked in a basement bunker beneath the Pearl Harbor Administration building, surrounded by captured Japanese codebooks, mechanical tabulating machines, and charts covered with partially decoded intercepts. The commander himself rarely left his underground domain, surviving on coffee and sandwiches while working 8-hour days to unlock Japanese naval secrets. His dedication had paid off spectacularly when intercepts revealed that the Japanese were planning a major operation against a target designated AF. The Americans suspected AF referred to Midway, but they needed confirmation. In a stroke of pure intelligence, artistry, Rochefort suggested that Midway transmit a false message in plain language claiming that its water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese intercepts mentioned that AF was experiencing freshwater shortages, confirming that Midway was indeed the target of the coming offensive. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Nimitz had deployed his limited forces with surgical precision. Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance positioned itself northeast of Midway, while Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher took station nearby. The Americans knew not only where the Japanese would strike, but approximately when they would arrive and from which direction they would approach. The intelligence coup extended beyond simple location data. American codebreakers had identified the composition of Nagumo's striking force, including the names of individual ships and their commanders. They knew that Yamamoto himself would follow with the main battle fleet, positioned too far away to intervene in the initial engagement. Most crucially, they understood the Japanese plan called for neutralizing Midway's airbase before turning to engage any American fleet that might respond to the attack. This knowledge allowed the Americans to position their forces perfectly for a surprise attack. While the Japanese searched empty ocean to the south and west, confident that any American response would come from Pearl Harbor, Spruance and Fletcher's carriers waited undetected to the northeast. The American commanders had achieved the holy grail of naval warfare. They would attack an enemy who didn't know they were there. At 9:20 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey prepared to launch his dive bombers from the Enterprise. Intelligence briefing had been precise. Japanese carriers would be found approximately 200 miles southwest of his current position. Having just launched their own aircraft against Midway, the timing would be perfect. He would arrive just as the enemy was most vulnerable. With their flight decks crowded with returning aircraft and fuel lines exposed, meanwhile, aboard the Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie readied his own squadron of dauntless dive bombers. The carrier had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral, see that she should have spent months in dry dock for proper repairs. Instead, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers had accomplished a miracle of improvisation, patching the flight deck and restoring essential systems in just 3 days. Yorktown's participation in the battle represented American determination and industrial capability at its finest. Intelligence. Historian David Kahn noted in the Codebreakers that the Battle of Midway represented perhaps the most decisive intelligence victory in naval history, comparable to Nelson's triumph at Trafalgar. The contrast between American preparation and Japanese confusion was now complete. While Nagumo's staff struggled with fragmentary reconnaissance reports and conflicting mission requirements, their enemies possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese intentions and capabilities. The intelligence advantage would prove more valuable. The numerical superiority or technological innovation, demonstrating that information had become the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. At 9:18 on the morning of June 4th, the reconnaissance plane from the heavy cruiser Tone finally provided the information that would seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. The pilot's voice crackled across the radio with words that struck Nagumo's bridge like a physical blow. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier bringing up the rear. Carrier, the one thing that could destroy his entire force. If he failed to strike first, the Admiral's worst fears had been confirmed. Not only were American ships present, but they possessed the one weapon system capable of matching his own striking power. Nagumo immediately ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with anti-ship weapons, but the flight decks of his 4 carriers had already descended into organized chaos. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the wooden planking while fuel lines snaked between them like deadly serpents. What should have been a routine operation had become a race against time. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the carrier Soryu watched his deck crews work with desperate efficiency, knowing that every minute of delay increased their vulnerability. The Japanese had perfected the art of coordinated carrier operations during months of combat across the Pacific. But their very success had bred a dangerous overconfidence. They had never before faced an enemy who knew their exact location while remaining hidden themselves. At 9:25, Nagumo made a decision that would haunt Japanese naval historians for decades. Instead of launching his partially armed aircraft immediately against the reported American force, he chose to wait until the rearming process was complete and his returning Midway strike force had been recovered. The Admiral wanted to launch a fully coordinated attack with maximum strength rather than a hasty assault with whatever aircraft happened to be ready. The decision reflected sound tactical doctrine under normal circumstances, But these were not normal circumstances. Unknown. To Nagumo, American dive bombers were already airborne and racing toward his position. The intelligence advantage that had given the Americans perfect knowledge of Japanese intentions was about to manifest itself in the most decisive manner possible. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led 33 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie commanded 17 more from the Yorktown. These 50 aircraft represented the concentrated striking power of the American Pacific Fleet. Armed with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs specifically designed to penetrate carrier flight decks, they had been launched at precisely the right moment to catch the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. The American pilots faced their own challenges as they searched the vast Pacific for targets. McCluskey had initially flown toward the calculated intercept position, only to find empty ocean. The Japanese fleet had turned north after launching its Midway strike. Following a course change that wasn't reflected in the original intelligence estimate. For crucial minutes, it seemed the Americans might miss their opportunity entirely, but McCluskey demonstrated the kind of tactical intuition that separates great naval aviators from merely competent ones. Spotting a Japanese destroyer racing northeast the Arashi, which had been detached to attack an American submarine, he deduced that the ship was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. Following the destroyer's wake like a highway in the sky, McCluskey's dive bombers finally spotted their targets at 10-20-2, military historian Gordon Prange wrote in Miracle at Midway that Nagumo's decision to wait for a coordinated strike represented sound tactical thinking undermined by incomplete intelligence. Sight that greeted McCluskey exceeded his most optimistic expectations. For Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Fuel lines crisscrossed the wooden decking, while ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the rearming process. Carriers were caught in the most vulnerable possible configuration, able to launch aircraft quickly while presenting maximum targets for aerial attack. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, unaware that American dive bombers were already beginning their attack runs high above. His staff had detected approaching torpedo bombers and fighters at low altitude, but these attacks had been beaten off with relative ease. The Admiral's attention was focused downward on the surface threats he could see while death approached. Silently from the morning sky above his fleet, at 10:24 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive, beginning what would become known as the most decisive 5 minutes in naval aviation history. Below him, the 4 aircraft carriers of Admiral Nagumo's striking force steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance in the final stages of preparation for launch. McCluskey had divided his attack between the 2 nearest carriers. He personally led 13 dive bombers against the flagship Akagi, while Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best took 14 more against the Kaga. The Japanese had no warning of the attack from above. Their attention was focused entirely on the low-level torpedo bomber assault that was approaching from the opposite direction, an attack they were successfully repelling with devastating losses to the American aircraft. The irony was perfect and terrible. Japanese fighters had shot down most of the American torpedo bombers, but in doing so they had been drawn down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the other low-flying attackers had cleared the way for the dive bombers to approach unmolested from 20,000 feet. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched the destruction of the American torpedo attack with grim satisfaction. His fighters had performed magnificently, and his ship's anti-aircraft fire had added to the carnage. Only 3 American torpedo bombers had survived to launch their weapons, and all 3 torpedoes had missed their targets. The morning's engagement seemed to be proceeding according to Japanese expectations despite the earlier confusion. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, was actually smiling as he observed the wreckage of American aircraft floating in his ship's wake. The enemy's aviation had proven no match for Japanese superiority in training and equipment. In a few minutes, his own aircraft would be ready to launch a devastating counterstrike against the American carriers. The Battle of Midway would end as another glorious victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Then lookouts began, screaming warnings about dive bombers approaching from overhead. Aoki looked up to see American aircraft diving almost vertically toward his flight deck, their wings extending like the talons of hunting hawks. There was no time to take evasive action, no time to sound general quarters properly, barely time. To comprehend that his ship was about to die, McCluskey's first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar below where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Within seconds, Japan's premier aircraft carrier had been transformed from an instrument of war into a blazing wreck, according to survivor accounts collected by naval historian Walter Lord. An incredible victory. The transformation from victory to disaster took place so rapidly that many Japanese sailors initially couldn't comprehend what was happening. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Best's bombers were attacking Kaga with equally devastating results. The veteran carrier, which had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, took multiple hits that ignited massive fires among her aircraft and fuel supplies. Like her flagship sister, Kaga was doomed within minutes of the first bomb impact. To the north, Lieutenant Commander Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown were attacking Soryu with the precision of a surgical strike. Despite having accidentally dropped their bombs during the launch process, a mechanical failure that should have ruined the attack, Leslie's pilots pressed home. Their assault with machine guns and the few bombs that remained, their courage, was rewarded when Soryu erupted in flames after taking 3 direct hits. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had been mortally wounded. The careful coordination that had made the Imperial Japanese Navy invincible across the Pacific had collapsed under the weight of American intelligence and tactical surprise. Planes that should have been launched against American ships instead became fuel for the fires that were consuming Japan's naval aviation from within. Only Hiryu remained operational, steaming separately from the main formation under the command of Rear Admiral Tamone Yamaguchi. The veteran admiral immediately began launching every aircraft his ship could muster, determined to strike back at the Americans who had dealt such a devastating blow to Japanese naval power. The Battle of Midway was not yet over, but its outcome had been decided in those 5 miraculous minutes when American dive bombers found their targets perfectly positioned for destruction. Rear Admiral Tamone Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, watching pillars of black smoke rise from his sister ships as they burned helplessly in the Pacific morning. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the veteran carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized Allied shipping from Hawaii to Ceylon, were now blazing wrecks, their aircraft and crews feeding the flames that marked the end of Japanese naval dominance. But Yamaguchi was not a man to accept defeat while he still possessed the means to fight. Hiryu had been steaming separately from the main formation and had escaped the American dive bomber attack that devastated the other 3 carriers. His ship still carried 40 operational aircraft and experienced pilots, enough to launch a counterstrike that might yet salvage something from the disaster unfolding around him. At 11 o'clock, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters from Hiryu's deck, their mission to locate and destroy the American carriers that had dealt such a devastating blow to the mobile striking force. The pilots were among the best remaining in the Imperial Japanese Navy, veterans of countless engagements who understood that this might be their last opportunity to strike back at their enemies. The Japanese had finally located the American task force through reconnaissance, identifying 3 carriers operating northeast of Midway. What they didn't know was that one of those carriers, the Yorktown, was already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea and had been rushed into service despite incomplete repairs. The ship's participation in the battle represented American determination to fight with every available asset, even those that should have been in dry dock for months. Kobayashi's attack group found their target at 12:10 in the afternoon. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined defense by American fighters, the Japanese pilots pressed home their assault with the skill and courage that had made them feared across the Pacific. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, causing significant damage and forcing the carrier to reduce speed as damage control parties fought to contain the destruction. For a brief moment, it seemed that Japanese aviation might yet prove decisive. Yorktown was listing and apparently dead in the water, while smoke billowed from her flight deck. American personnel were abandoning ship, and the carrier appeared to be sinking beneath the Pacific waves. Kobayashi radioed back to Hiryu that he had destroyed an American carrier. It's news that brought momentary hope to the surviving Japanese forces, but the Americans had learned much about damage control from their earlier defeats. Yorktown's crew worked with desperate efficiency to restore power and steering, drawing on lessons learned at the Coral Sea. Within an hour, the carrier was making 20 knots and appeared fully operational to Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. That spotted her later in the afternoon. Naval architect Norman Friedman noted in U.S. aircraft carriers that American damage control procedures had evolved significantly since Pearl Harbor, emphasizing rapid restoration of essential systems over complete repairs. At 1:30, Yamaguchi launched a second strike against the Americans' 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. This would be Tominaga's final mission. His aircraft had been damaged over the atoll and couldn't retract its landing gear, meaning he lacked the fuel capacity to return to his carrier after the attack. Tominaga's attack succeeded in hitting Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, causing severe flooding and forcing the crew to abandon ship for a second time. The veteran carrier, which had survived the Coral Sea, only to participate in this climactic battle, finally succumbed to the accumulated damage from 2 separate Japanese strikes. But even this success came at terrible cost. Most of the attacking aircraft were shot down by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire, while Yamaguchi celebrated the apparent destruction of 2 American carriers. He remained unaware that his enemies still possessed 2 undamaged flat tops, Enterprise and Hornet. These ships were already launching their own aircraft for a final strike against Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier in the Pacific. The Americans had achieved what their enemies thought impossible. They had absorbed severe punishment, while maintaining the capability to deliver decisive countermeasures. The battle was entering its final phase. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese coordination had collapsed entirely under the weight of American intelligence and tactical surprise, leaving individual ships to fight desperate holding actions against overwhelming odds. The Empire's last strike had inflicted damage on its enemies, but it could not restore the strategic balance that had been lost in those 5 devastating minutes. When dive bombers found their targets perfectly prepared for destruction, at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey found himself airborne once again, leading 24 dive bombers from Enterprise toward the last Japanese aircraft carrier still capable of operations. The Hiryu steamed alone on the darkening Pacific. Her escorts formed in a desperate defensive circle around the Empire's final hope of salvaging victory from the catastrophe that had befallen the Mobile. Understood that his ship represented Japan's last chance to inflict meaningful damage on the American fleet. His attacks against Yorktown had succeeded in crippling that carrier. But intelligence reports confirmed that 2 other American flat tops remained operational and were actively hunting his forces. The tactical situation had reversed completely. Since morning now, it was the Japanese who were outnumbered and fighting for survival. As McCluskey's dive bombers approached their target, the setting sun cast long shadows across the Pacific, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson that seemed prophetic of the blood that would soon stain these waters. The American pilot had already achieved immortality by leading the attack that crippled 3 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes. But he was determined to complete the destruction of enemy naval aviation that his morning strike had begun. Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the American dive bombers began their attack runs, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracers that streaked through the twilight like deadly fireworks. Japanese fighters rose from the carrier's deck in a final, desperate attempt to protect their ship. But there were too few of them to prevent the inevitable. The numerical advantage had shifted decisively in America's favor. At 5:03, the first American bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck, detonating among aircraft being prepared for a third strike against the American fleet. Secondary explosions rippled through the carrier as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Within minutes, Japan's last operational aircraft carrier had joined her sisters as a blazing wreck, drifting helplessly on the Pacific swells. Captain Tomi Okaku stood on Haryu's bridge beside Admiral Yamaguchi, both men watching their ship die. Around them, as fires consumed the wooden flight deck and spread throughout the hull, the carrier that had participated in every major Japanese naval victory since, Pearl Harbor was now contributing to the most decisive defeat in the Empire's maritime history. The irony was not lost on either officer. They had helped create the tactical innovations that were now being used to destroy them. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote in History of United States, Naval Operations in World War II, that the Battle of Midway marked the moment when American industrial and technological capabilities began to overshadow Japanese tactical excellence. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the extent of the Japanese disaster became clear to both sides. For aircraft carriers representing the heart of Japan's naval aviation lay burning or sinking in waters that would soon become their grave. With them went over 250 aircraft and many of the Empire's most experienced pilots. Losses that could never be replaced given Japan's limited industrial capacity and pilot training programs. Admiral Yamamoto, following with the main battle fleet, received the crushing news of his mobile striking force's destruction with characteristic stoicism. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately that Japan had lost not just a battle, but the war itself. Without carrier-based aviation, the Empire could no longer project power across the Pacific or defend its far-flung conquests against American counterattack. The brilliant deception that had lured the Japanese into American waters had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections. Japanese coordination had indeed fallen apart under Midway's trap, but the collapse went deeper than tactical confusion. The intelligence advantage that allowed Americans to position their forces perfectly had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese planning and decision-making that would plague the Empire throughout the remainder of the war. As dawn broke on June 5th, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had slipped beneath the Pacific waves, taking with them Japan's hopes of victory. In the war they had started at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would echo across the Pacific for the next 3 years as America's industrial might transformed tactical victory into strategic dominance. The rising sun that had symbolized Japanese expansion across the Pacific was setting at last, replaced by the stars and stripes that would soon fly over Tokyo Bay itself.